Hello. Welcome to Week 2, Lesson 2 for the fiction track. This is for the week of April 6th through the 9th. Remember, we're studying fiction, specifically short stories, in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, and historical fiction. For Lesson 2, we're going to add a tool to your tool belt to help you analyze writers' craft in fiction. Remember that craft refers to decisions writers make to create engaging, effective pieces of writing. What choices do they make that make their writing what it is? The craft move we learned last lesson was that to create a believable setting for these kinds of stories, you can use details of what you know, details, feelings from settings, as a bridge to the world that you make up with your imagination. That way, readers are still able to picture what you're talking about. For Lesson 2, we're going to look at two mentor texts. A mentor text would be a well-written story that acts as a mentor to you, teaching you through the choices that the author made in the mentor text, how to also make mature choices as a mature writer in your writing yourself. The two stories we're going to use are the fantasy story The Third Wish by Joan Aiken and the historical fiction story A Horseman in the Sky by Ambrose Bierce. We will learn how to use these well-written stories as a guide to learn new craft tools for writing fiction. We're going to look specifically at how to study setting and notice its impact on the plot and the characters. There are two levels of setting that you want to remember to notice. First is the micro level, which is closest to the character. Their intimate, immediate surroundings, family, community, home, school, etc. The macro level of setting would be the broader world the character lives in. What's going on politically in that area? Are there wars? Is it a time of peace? What is the type of world that the character lives in? Is it a dystopia? Is it a utopia? Is it times like ours? An example would be for Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings. His micro-level setting is that he lives in a happy community in the Shire, he has good friends and a close relationship with his uncle. He seems to be generally pretty carefree, before the story gets going, that is. His parents are never mentioned. In the macro level, Frodo lives in the Shire, and all of Middle-earth, including the Shire, are in danger of being devastated by the evil Dark Lord Sauron if Frodo does not make the treacherous journey to Mordor to destroy the ring. He's surrounded by enemies and a few good friends, all of whose fates lie with him destroying the ring. So those two settings are all playing together to create the atmosphere of Frodo's story. With that in mind, I want to show you a strategy to help you look at the setting in any story. The strategy is called, does the story have to be set there and then? And basically what you do is you ask yourself questions about the story and the setting and the characters and the plot that help you understand the role the setting is playing in that story. Let's look at some of the questions. What's the time, place, weather, culture of this story? Look for places where the author describes in detail. All of those things influence the story. Imagine the story in a different time or place. How would it go? If the setting were changed, would the plot change? How does the character act in the setting? How is it influencing them? Why is the setting important to this story? Why did the author choose this particular setting? And challenge question, do you think there's any symbolism in the setting? Because that can go a really long way in making meaning out of a story. There are some different questions you might want to focus on if you're looking at historical fiction, because there are other elements that play into the setting of historical fiction. For instance, what's the significance of this time and place in history? Is there information that the author has provided for you in the historical notes in the text, maybe at the beginning or the end or in a prologue, or that you could look up online, maybe in the library's database, to get a better understanding of this time period so that you understand what's happening in the story and what the different tensions are that come into play? Think about three areas that will really influence the story or social issues. Which ones are at play? What do you know about the economics of the time? And any details you know about the politics of the time. All of those things usually greatly influence historical fiction stories. Then think, if the setting changed, how would the plot change? How does the setting affect the character? In sci-fi, fantasy, and historical fiction, the setting plays a huge role and dramatically influences the character and the plot. And stopping to notice that teaches you a lot about the story. Our first mentor text is Joan Aiken's fantasy story, The Third Wish. Let's look at part of it together and keep those questions in the back of your mind. We'll go over them in a minute. All right, here we go. I'm going to read you just the first part of the story. The Third Wish by Joan Aiken. Once there was a man who was driving in his car at dusk on a spring evening through part of the forest of Savernake. His name was Mr. Peters. The primroses were just beginning, but the trees were still bare and it was cold. The birds had stopped singing an hour ago. As Mr. Peters entered a straight, empty stretch of road, he seemed to hear a faint crying and a struggling, thrashing, as if somebody was in trouble, far away in the trees. He left his car and climbed the mossy bank beside the road. Beyond the bank was an open slope of beech trees leading down to thorn bushes through which he saw the gleam of water. He stood a moment waiting to try and discover where the noise was coming from, and presently he heard a rustling and some strange cries in a voice which was almost human, and yet there was something too hoarse about it at one time and too clear and sweet at another. Mr. Peters ran down the hill. As he neared the bushes, he saw something white among them which was trying to extricate itself. Coming closer, he found it was a swan that had become entangled in the thorns growing on the bank of the canal. The bird struggled all the more frantically as he approached, looking at him with hate in its yellow eyes, and when he took hold of it to free it, it hissed at him, pecked him, and thrashed dangerously with its wings, which were powerful enough to break his arm. Nevertheless, he managed to release it from the thorns, and carrying it tightly under one arm, holding the snaky head well away with the other hand, for he did not wish his eyes pecked out, he looked to the verge of the canal and dropped it in. The swan instantly assumed great dignity and sailed out to the middle of the water, where it put itself to rights with much dabbling and preening, smoothing its feathers with little showers of drops. Mr. Peters waited to make sure that it was all right and had suffered no damage from its struggles. Presently, the swan, when it was satisfied with its appearance, floated onto the bank once more, and in a moment, instead of a great white bird, there was a little man, all in green, with a golden crown and long beard, standing by the water. He had fierce glittering eyes and looked by no means friendly. "Well, sir," he said threateningly, "I see you're presumptuous enough to know some of the laws of magic. You think that because you have rescued, by pure good fortune, the king of the forest from a difficulty, you should have some fabulous reward. I expect 3 wishes, no more, no less," Mr. Peters answered, looking at him steadily and with composure. 3 wishes he wants, the clever man. Well, I have yet to hear of a human being who made any good use of his 3 wish. They mostly end up worse off than they started. Take your 3 wishes then. He flung 3 dead leaves in the air. Don't blame me if you spend the last wish on doing the work of the other 2. Mr. Peters caught the leaves and put 2 of them carefully in his note case. We will come back. You can finish that story later if you would like. But let's look through some of the questions to get us thinking about the setting of this story. Remember that authors use details and feelings that are familiar to us from settings we know to help us picture settings that they make up. So, what's the time, place, weather, and culture of this story? We don't know all the answers to this, but we can tell that it's set in a forest in the evening. Forests at evening start to get dark, right? And there's a lot of stories in which it's a place of magic. And so this author is playing off of that common background knowledge that readers of stories have. Imagine that the story was in a different time or place. How would it go? Could you set this story in a city? Could you set this story on Mars? It just really needs to be where it is because the magic of the forest and the swan all plays deeply into this story. If the setting changed, how would the plot change? How does the character act in the setting? Isn't it interesting that Mr. Peters seemed totally unfazed by the fact that the swan was actually the king of a forest? Why is the setting important to the story? Why did the author choose this particular setting? Do you think there's any symbolism in the setting? I don't want to spoil the story for you. It's linked in the slideshow. You can look at it. But I do think there's symbolism in the setting. And I think that a lot of these questions, when you know how the story goes, they're very important to the setting is very important to the story because it shapes the outcome. Let's look at a piece of historical fiction and see if the questions that we have help us also deduce craft tricks from that mentor text. This is from Ambrose Bierce's historical fiction story, A Horseman in the Sky, which is set during the Civil War, the American Civil War. So everything you know about the American Civil War, get that in your mind as you hear this snippet from that story. The sleeping sentinel, or guard, in the clump of laurel was a young Virginian named Carter Druce. He was the son of wealthy parents, an only child, and had known such ease and cultivation and high living as wealth and taste were able to command in the mountain country of western Virginia. His home was but a few miles from where he lay now. One morning he had risen from the breakfast table and said quietly but gravely, "Father, a Union regiment has arrived at Grafton. I am going to join it." The father lifted his leonine head, looked at the son a moment in silence, and replied, "Well, go, sir, and whatever may occur, do what you conceive to be your duty. Virginia, to which you are a traitor, must get on without you. Should we both live to the end of this war, we will speak further of the matter. Your mother, as the physician has informed you, is in a most critical condition. At the best, she cannot be with us longer than a few weeks, but that time is precious. It would be better not to disturb her." So Carter Druce, bowing reverently to his father, who returned the salute with a stately curtsy that masked a breaking heart, left the home of his childhood to go soldiering. By conscience and courage, by deeds of devotion and daring, he soon commended himself to his fellows and his officers, and it was to these qualities and to some knowledge of the country that he owed his selection for this present perilous duty at the extreme outpost. Nevertheless, fatigue had been stronger than resolution, and he had fallen asleep. Thinking about the author's craft and the details they used, let's also think through the big picture of this setting. What's the significance in this time and place in history? Okay, this is set in Virginia. He chooses to become a Union soldier, though Virginia sided with the South, and go against his family. Can you get information from the text? So there's what we know from the internet, from school, and from studying the Civil War, and maybe notes that could be with this story. We know that he's in Southern Territory. If he's in Virginia, he's in his home area, which is significant to, imagine personally being near your home and fighting for the opposite side, right? Think about social issues at play. We can tell from the description that he was from a well-to-do family, and I think it's very interesting the way his father reacted. It's not the typical response you would expect from that family setting. What do you know so far about the economics of this time? At the beginning of the war, his family was doing very well. Likely by the end, they won't be. What details do you know about the politics of this time? We're in a civil war. Politics play a pretty big role in this story. If the setting changed, how would the plot change? Significantly, because he wouldn't be soldiering, right? And how is the setting affecting the character? So he's near home and he's supposed to be looking out, and yet he has fallen asleep. I wonder for what reason? Because he's overly tired, stressed. Is he comfortable near his home? These are all questions you could find the answers to if you choose to continue reading this story. But what I want you to notice is that when we choose a set of questions to help us focus on an aspect of a story, like the setting, we can learn the craft tricks that the author uses, like using details about big things like the background of the story in the Civil War and his family in a flashback, and little things like that he's laying in a clump of laurel high up on a cliff to help us picture the story and feel like we're there, that call up our background knowledge of history and then help us insert that into this story to imagine it from this character's perspective. Now that you have had both the first two lessons, and we've looked at some mentor texts. The next thing that I want you to do is take what you've learned and reflect on it. So we've talked about how you can take things you're familiar with to create a world that's made up, that has details that will still feel familiar to your readers. We've talked about how you can use focused questions like, does the story have to be set then and there, to help you learn more about an author's story, like a mentor text, so that you can look at what did they do well that you could maybe use as a teacher or a guide to help you as you tackle writing in this genre. The goal now would be that you go to Google Classroom or Canvas, depending on what your teacher uses, and you fill out the reflection called Virtual My Identity as a Reader and Writer Week 2 Reflections. If you have questions, please reach out to your teacher or to me. We're here to help, and we're excited to be learning along with you. Have a great day. And one more thing, there are other resources in this slideshow that you can look through. There's a glossary of terms that might help you remember some literary terms and some important ideas for writing stories. And here are the stories I've been referencing. They're all linked there in case you would like to read more of them. Totally up to you. So go ahead and go do the reflections in Google Classroom or Canvas and share what you're learning and show what you know. Have a great day.